The ropes were still swaying when the rancher rode into the clearing. 5 young women hung upside down from the thick branch of a dead cottonwood at the edge of Black Mesa Canyon. Their wrists were bound, their faces streaked with dust and something darker, and the last orange light of sunset was already sliding off the cliffs behind them. One boot rocked gently on its own, as if the woman wearing it had stopped fighting only seconds ago. There was no crowd, no sheriff, no explanation nailed to the tree. Just the creak of hemp against bark and 5 lives running out of time. The rancher looked once at the ropes, then at the fresh horse tracks pressed into the sand, leading south. He never said a word. He reached beneath his saddle for the skinning knife he kept there, tested the edge against his thumb out of pure habit, and swung down from his horse. By the time the first rope hit the ground, he already understood one terrible thing. Whoever had done this wasn't finished. People around Red Hollow called him Elias Mercer, though most just called him the Silent Rancher. Some said he'd lost his voice in the war. Others swore grief had taken it, the year bandits burned his family's ranch to the foundation stones. Elias never corrected either story. Silence, he'd found, answered questions better than words ever did. He lived alone on a weathered cattle spread 20 miles from town, and everything he needed to say, he said with his hands, his eyes, or the set of his jaw. 3 days before, he'd noticed strangers cutting across the old grazing trails. Their horses were well fed, their tack too fine for working men. No cattle brands, no mining tools. Men who dressed like that and carried nothing useful were carrying something else instead. Then came the smoke, not a wildfire. Too thin, too controlled. Smoke from a fire someone had built on purpose. It rose from the old stage relay station abandoned for years. When Elias rode in, he found the wagon wheels smashed to splinters, blood gone brown and tacky across the porch steps, and half buried in the dirt beside a boot print far too large to belong to anyone he knew, a child's carved wooden horse. He picked it up without thinking and slid it into his coat pocket. He couldn't have said why it mattered, it just did. Now, kneeling beneath the cottonwood with that same little horse pressed flat against his ribs, he cut the second rope. One by one, the women dropped into the sand. 2 didn't move. One barely breathed, her chest rising in small, frightened increments. Another's eyes fluttered open, just long enough to find his face before rolling shut again. The 5th looked straight at him, lucid, terrified, and held on. Please. Her lips had cracked from thirst, and the word split one of them open again. They're taking the children. 4 words. They rearranged everything. Elias's eyes went to the southern trail, fresh tracks, deep ones cut by heavy wagons, near a dozen riders, maybe more. And threaded in among the hoof prints, smaller and shallower, children's footprints. The men who'd done this had less than 4 days before they crossed into Mexico, where money changed hands in the dark and people simply stopped existing. Past that line, there'd be no finding anyone, not alive. The clock had already started. The nearest doctor was in Red Hollow, almost 12 miles off. Elias lifted each woman onto a spare horse with as much care as his shaking hands could manage and started the long ride through gathering dark. Somewhere out past the valley, coyotes were already calling to each other, and thunder muttered low over the mountains like it was deciding whether to bother. Every mile he covered was a mile the kidnappers put behind them going the other way. Dr. Miriam Hale came out of her clinic at a dead run the moment she saw what he'd brought her. What happened? She was already moving, hands finding pulses, checking pupils. Elias only pointed south. She traced the rope burns circling each woman's wrists, and her jaw tightened until it looked carved from stone. They weren't meant to survive this. They were meant to die slow. One of the women, Clara Bennett, she told them, forcing the words out between cracked breaths, fought to stay conscious. There were children, she said, 7, maybe 8. We could hear them crying inside the covered wagons. Who took them? Dr. Hale asked, gentle as she could manage while her hands worked. Clara swallowed like the name itself hurt going down. They worked for a man called Harland. The room went still. Even Sheriff Owen Briggs, who'd seen his share of ugliness in this county, lowered his eyes at the sound of it. Harland Kane. On paper, he ran freight lines stretching from Arizona territory down into northern Mexico. Legitimate, respectable, the kind of man who got invited to sit at the good table. Off paper, his name came trailing rumors like smoke off a grass fire, travelers who never made it home, orphans who vanished from mission steps, Families who searched for years and buried nothing because there was nothing to bury. Nobody had ever managed to prove a thing. Briggs took off his hat and turned it slowly in his hands. If Kane's mixed up in this, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Everyone in that room already understood exactly what it meant. Before sunrise, Elias saddled his fastest horse. Briggs tried to send deputies along with him, men with badges and rifles and presumably some sense of duty. Only one said yes, Deputy Caleb Ross, young, stubborn in the way young men often are, mistaking it for courage, badly out of his depth, and he knew it, and he came anyway. The rest of the office suddenly remembered lame horses, cracked rifle stocks, sick mothers-in-law, anything that kept them off Harland Kane's trail. Dr. Hale pressed a roll of bandages, a twist of dried meat, and a hand-drawn map into Elias's hands. 3 days, she said quietly, maybe less. That's what it'll take them to reach Eagle Pass Crossing. After that, she didn't finish that sentence either. She didn't have to. Elias had already done the math himself. He tucked the supplies away and reached into his coat one more time. He pressed the small carved horse into Clara's trembling palm, and her eyes filled before she'd even closed her fingers around it. "My little brother made this," she whispered, turning it over like it might vanish if she blinked. "He hid it in the wagon before they split us up." She looked up at Elias, and something in her voice cracked clean through. "If you find him, please don't let him think we stopped looking." Elias gave one slow nod. Then he swung up into the saddle and rode south, and he didn't look back once. By midday, the heat came up off the desert floor in visible waves, warping the horizon into something that shimmered and lied. The trail, easy enough to follow at first, dissolved into a scatter of volcanic rock, where every print had been swept clean. Somebody had done that on purpose. This wasn't panic, this was practice. Elias dismounted and read what was left to read. Broken cactus spines, fresh ash pressed under a thin skin of blown sand. A single thread of blue cloth snagged on a thorn bush, which he pinched free and tucked inside his coat without quite knowing yet what it meant. Further on, a wagon wheel had clipped a stone outcrop hard enough to leave behind a curl of fresh-cut oak, pale against the weathered rock. The trail held, barely. Somebody wanted him burning daylight. And daylight was the one thing he didn't have to spare. 68 hours now, and shrinking. As evening settled, thin gray smoke rose from a narrow slot canyon ahead. One fire, too small for the whole outfit. This was a scout camp, or men left behind to slow down whoever came looking. Elias tied his horse among the rocks and climbed the last stretch on his belly. Coming up slow at the ridgeline below, 3 riders lounged around a dying fire. One tossed a child's blanket onto the coals and laughed as it curled black. Another counted silver coins into neat little stacks. The third had a map spread across his knee, marked with a red circle. The wind carried most of their talk away, but one line reached him whole. "Boss says no witnesses reach the crossing." Elias's hand found the grip of his revolver and rested there. The real hunt had begun. He stayed motionless on that ridge while the fire popped and the 3 men beneath him laughed at nothing worth laughing at. Firelight caught along their rifle barrels like the flames themselves approved of the work being done. One man dug into his saddlebag and tossed another fistful of coins skyward, and the others whooped as silver rained into the dirt. "They'll fetch double for the young ones," the tallest one said, wiping his mouth. Another spat into the fire. "Don't much care either way. Kane pays, I ride." The third folded his map shut. "We move before first light. Main convoy hits Dry Creek by tomorrow afternoon. After that, it's a straight, hard push to Eagle Pass. 48 hours, maybe less." Elias eased himself backward off the ridge without a sound. These 3 weren't the real threat. Kill them now, and Kane would know someone was on the trail within hours. He needed the map. He needed answers first. He circled wide through the rocks to the far side of camp, where their horses stood tethered under a twisted juniper. One gelding carried a second saddlebag. Inside, dried rations, a box of fresh cartridges, and several folded sheets of paper that felt heavier than paper had any right to feel. He unfolded the first page, names. Beside each one, a number. No descriptions, no destinations, just names and prices laid out as plainly as a butcher's ledger. The second page was worse. Dates, meeting points, coded marks scattered from Arizona territory clear down into northern Mexico. This wasn't one crime, it was a supply chain. A twig snapped behind him. He spun as a young rider stepped out of the dark, shotgun already halfway to his shoulder. For one endless second, neither man moved. Then the rider's mouth opened. "Someone's here." The canyon came apart. Elias hit the dirt behind a boulder as buckshot tore through the brush above his head, showering rock chips across his face. He rolled, came up on one knee, and put a single shot through the shotgun's stock. It flew from the young man's hands. The other two scrambled for cover, firing wild into the dark. Instead of trading shots he didn't need to trade, Elias broke for the horses. One animal snapped its tether and bolted straight through the camp, dragging rope and chaos behind it. A few seconds of confusion, but a few seconds was all he needed. He swung up into his own saddle and vanished between the canyon walls with the stolen papers pressed against his chest, furious shouting chasing him into the dark. "After him!" Hooves thundered behind him on the stone. The chase was on. Night swallowed the desert whole. Moonlight barely found the trail as it twisted between towering walls of rock, and Elias pushed his horse, hard, loose stone skittering out from under pounding hooves. The riders stayed close. Too close. A rifle cracked. The bullet chewed a bright scar into the canyon wall, showering sparks that died before they hit the ground. A second shot took his hat clean off his head. He didn't look back. Instead, he remembered something an old cattleman had shown him once years ago, about a dry wash that ran out under a shelf of unstable sandstone. He aimed his horse straight for it. Behind him, the riders followed without hesitation, exactly as he'd hoped they would. At the last possible instant, he cut sharply through a gap in the rock almost too narrow to see in the dark. The lead outlaw missed the turn. His horse hit loose stone at a dead run, and the whole slope let go at once. Thousands of pounds of sandstone crashing down in a roar that swallowed everything, dust boiling up thick enough to blot out the stars. When it settled, the passage behind Elias had vanished under a wall of broken rock. The surviving riders shouted from the far side, trapped, at least for the moment. He'd bought hours, not days. Hours. The clock kept running anyway. Near sunrise, Elias reached an abandoned line shack above Dry Creek Valley. Somebody was already inside. His revolver came up before he'd finished thinking about it. So that's how Red Hollow greets its visitors these days. He knew that voice. Sheriff Owen Briggs, sitting by a cold stove with a coffee pot balanced on his knee. Elias lowered the gun, more surprised than he liked to admit. Briggs offered a tired half-smile. "Figured you'd need the help whether you asked for it or not." He'd brought coffee, fresh cartridges, spare horseshoes, the kind of practical kindness that didn't need announcing. Elias spread the stolen papers across the old table. Briggs studied them in silence, and his face went hard by degrees, like something setting. "I know these names." He tapped one entry. "Missing ranch hands," another. "A widow who vanished last winter," a third. "Pair of brothers out of Silver Ridge." He looked up. "This list goes back damn near 5 years. He unfolded the map beside it. Dozens of red circles scattered across isolated settlements, each one marking a place where somebody had simply stopped being seen. Kane had built an entire network and hidden it inside the bones of an ordinary freight business. "What kind of man makes his living off this?" Briggs asked, mostly to himself. Elias had no answer for him. Nobody did. By late afternoon, they reached a ridge above Dry Creek and looked down on the largest wagon train either of them had expected. 3 freight wagons, 8 riders, 2 spare remounts, and under heavy canvas, cages built from reinforced timber, sturdy enough to hold cattle, or worse. Children's voices drifted up whenever the wind shifted. Elias counted quickly. 7, maybe 8. But Clara had spoken of 5 young women taken in the first attack, and they weren't down there. Kane had split the group. Briggs lowered his field glass. "He's dividing them up." Elias nodded grimly. Every split made every rescue harder. Then a rider came down into the valley from the south, dressed in a dark frock coat instead of trail clothes, sitting his horse like a man used to being obeyed. The whole camp straightened up. Hats came off. Harland Kane had arrived. He wasn't loud about it, didn't draw a weapon, didn't raise his voice. He simply pointed, first at one wagon, then another, and within minutes the convoy split in 2. One wagon turned west. The rest continued south. "We can't follow both," Briggs said. They couldn't. Elias studied the tracks, the terrain, the light going gold and low. One trail carried the children they already knew about. The other headed into 50 miles of country with no settlements at all. Then he saw it. Small, easy to miss, tied to the rear axle of the western wagon, a scrap of blue cloth, fluttering once before catching the wind and vanishing around a bend. The same shade as the thread from the thorn bush. Someone inside that wagon was leaving a trail on purpose. But who? And how much longer would that thin flapping signal keep going before it ran out, or someone noticed it? Elias didn't hesitate. He pointed toward the western wagon. Briggs's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Then I'll take the southern road. If those children are still breathing, I'll do what I can to slow Kane's men down till you catch up. They clasped forearms once, hard, without another word between them. Neither man said what they were both thinking, that this might be the last time they saw each other's face. Then they rode apart under a sky burning down to the color of old copper. 30 hours left before the border. The western trail climbed into rough country, cliffs pressing the road down to a track barely wide enough for one wagon at a time. Elias hung back, following faint wheel ruts and the occasional flash of blue tide where only someone watching closely would ever see it. Whoever was leaving that trail understood something about hope, that it survives on small signs, not grand gestures. Near midnight he found another one, a broken silver locket, half buried at the trail's edge. Inside, a tiny pencil drawing of two sisters standing in front of a farmhouse, the lines gone soft with age, fresh scratches marking the hinge where someone had forced it open not long ago. He pocketed it and kept moving. 100 yards on, fresh boot prints broke away from the wagon tracks. One set, small, careful. He followed them through grass that brushed his waist until they ended at a dry creek bed, where a girl no older than 14 crouched in the brush. A torn blanket wrapped around her shoulders and a fist-sized stone gripped in one hand like a weapon. She saw him and raised the stone higher. He lifted both hands slowly. Empty. "I got out," she said after a long moment, voice raw. "My sisters didn't." Her name was Emma Whitaker. The 5 women rescued from the cottonwood had drawn the guard's attention on purpose 2 nights back, buying her just enough chaos to slip under a wagon unseen. She'd been hiding and moving and hoping ever since, waiting for someone, anyone, to follow the trail she was leaving. The blue cloth, Elias said. It was the first thing he'd said aloud in longer than he could remember, and the sound of his own voice startled him almost as much as it startled her. "I tied a strip wherever I could tear one loose." She pointed west. "They took 5 girls to an old silver mine. The children are still with Kane's main group, but the girls..." Her voice thinned to almost nothing. "The foreman said they'd be made into an example." Elias felt the hours pressing down on his chest like a hand. 28 left, maybe fewer. Before dawn they reached the abandoned San Rosario mine, once a fortune in silver, now just collapsed timber and silence. A deep ravine ringed with rusted machinery that groaned every time the wind found it. Smoke rose from a single bunkhouse still standing. Elias counted 6 guards outside. Likely more inside. A straight assault would get everyone killed before it accomplished anything. He and Emma worked their way around the camp's edge until they found an old man wrestling with a broken water pump. His beard had gone white years ago and one leg dragged with every step he took. When Elias stepped into view, the man nearly dropped his wrench. "I don't work for these men because I want to," he said quietly, before either of them could speak. "Name's Thomas Avery." He glanced toward the bunkhouse and something moved behind his eyes. "They killed my boy when he wouldn't help them." Thomas laid it out fast and plain. Kane used dead mines like this one as holding pens, because nobody with sense ever wandered into them uninvited. The 5 girls were locked in the old ore warehouse, guarded around the clock. Come sunset, they'd be moved south to rejoin the main convoy. After that, they'd be gone for good 21 hours. Thomas sketched the camp's layout from memory in the dirt. "There's an old drainage tunnel runs under the warehouse. Flooded out years back. Most folks around here forgot it's even there." He looked hard at Elias. "But it opens up right inside." For the first time since the cottonwood, something like hope crept back in. A thin thread of it, but real. The tunnel smelled of wet earth and rotted timber. Water climbed to their knees as they moved through total dark. Emma cradling a lantern under her coat so only a sliver of light escaped, just enough to dodge the rotten beams overhead. Boots crossed the floor above them, voices muffled and unclear. Then closer, a sound none of them mistook, someone crying. The tunnel ended behind a wall of loose stone hidden under stacked supply crates. Thomas worked 2 of the rocks free, and a narrow gap opened into the warehouse beyond. Inside, 5 girls sat with their wrists bound, watched over by 2 guards playing cards under a hanging lantern. One girl's ankle had bled clean through a strip of torn cloth. Another fought just to keep her eyes open. Emma clapped a hand over her own mouth to keep from making a sound. Elias watched the guards. One reached for a whiskey bottle. Other laughed at something that wasn't funny. Now, he came through the gap fast, dropping the nearest guard with the butt of his revolver before the man had fully turned. The second lunged for his rifle, too slow. Emma hurled the lantern. Glass burst apart and lamp oil caught in an instant. Fire crawling fast across the spilled fuel, smoke rolling thick through the warehouse rafters. Elias cut the girls loose one after another while flame ate through the wood behind him. Then a rifle cracked somewhere outside. The alarm had found them. Gunfire broke out across the whole camp. Men shouted from every direction at once. Thomas slammed the warehouse door and threw his weight behind heavy crates, Elias adding his own. But the barrier only bought seconds. Bullets were already punching clean through the old timber. One caught Thomas high in the shoulder and spun him half around. "I'm fine," he said through gritted teeth, and it was a lie anyone could see, blood already soaking dark through his shirt. The drainage tunnel was the only way out left. One by one, the rescued girls dropped down into the dark, Emma steadying the weakest of them by the elbow. Thomas waited until every last one had gone through. Then he shoved the final crate against the shattered doorframe. "Go on," he said. Elias grabbed his arm. Thomas only smiled, sad and certain. "I go with you. They run down all of you before you clear the ridge." Outside, axes were already splitting the door. Splinters rained inward. "There's got to be another way," Emma pleaded. Thomas pressed a ring of old iron keys into Elias's hand instead of answering. "Finish what my boy couldn't." He turned his back on them, lifted a dropped rifle, and faced the door alone. The first plank gave way. Elias understood then. Some sacrifices aren't forced on a man, some are chosen. He led the others back into the tunnel with gunfire echoing at their backs, and it took everything in him not to turn around. One final shot rang out behind them. Then nothing. Had Thomas bought them the time they needed, or had it cost him everything for nothing? The tunnel twisted under the mountain like something alive and dying at once. Water splashed around their boots, dust sifting down from the ceiling every time another muffled shot echoed above. None of the girls said a word. They didn't have to. They all understood exactly what Thomas Avery had just done for them. Elias carried the youngest when her ankle finally gave out completely. Emma stayed close behind, half carrying another girl whose wrists had swollen dark from the rope. Somewhere above, boots kept moving, kept hunting. They weren't safe yet, not close. When the tunnel finally opened onto the far side of the ravine, dawn was just starting to bleed color into the eastern sky. Elias paused long enough to look back. Smoke curled up from the mine behind them. Kane's men had found the escape, and the chase would be coming within minutes. Worse, Kane still had the children. This wasn't finished. It was only half done. 18 hours left before Eagle Pass. The rescued girls couldn't go any farther on foot. Elias led them to an old line cabin tucked among the cedars a few miles off, a place cattle drovers had abandoned so long ago most folks had forgotten it existed. Inside, blankets, a full water barrel, enough dried food to keep 5 exhausted girls fed for days if it came to that. Emma watched him check his gear, and her face tightened with understanding. "You're going after the children." He nodded once. "You can't do that alone." He didn't argue, because there was nothing to argue with. She pulled the broken silver locket from her pocket and pressed it into his hand. "My older sister, Sarah, she's still with them." Her fingers closed his around the locket. "If you find her, tell her I never once stopped looking." Elias gave a slow, solemn nod, swung up onto his worn-out horse, and rode alone toward Eagle Pass. By midday, the trail opened into flat desert. Fresh wagon ruts crossed hard-packed ground, mixed in with dozens of hoofprints. Briggs had been through here, and not quietly. Broken rifle stocks, scattered brass, blood gone dark and stiff in the sand. No bodies, though. That mattered. Something small caught Elias's eye near a shattered wagon wheel. Briggs's sheriff's star, lying face up in the dirt. He picked it up and turned it over, not dropped, placed, a message deliberate as a signature. The sheriff was alive, captured, maybe, but alive. Farther on, another sign. One of Kane's freight wagons had thrown a wheel in the fighting, and the repair had cost the convoy time. For the first time since the cottonwood, Harland Kane was running behind schedule. The clock, for once, had slowed, only a little, but a little was something. Late that afternoon, Elias reached Eagle Pass, where steep bluffs pinched down toward the river. A weathered customs post sat on one side, the wide brown sweep of the Rio Grande on the other. Several freight wagons already waited near the ferry landing, and frightened young voices drifted out from under the canvas. Kane meant to cross before sunset. Once those wagons touched the far bank, the trail would scatter into a country where finding anyone again would be next to impossible. Elias counted guards, too many for a straight fight. Then he saw Sheriff Briggs standing beside Kane himself, hands bound, face bruised, but on his feet. Kane paced in front of him, unhurried, almost bored. "You should have stayed home, Sheriff." Briggs spat blood before he answered. "I'd rather die out here than help a man like you." Kane's smile didn't touch his eyes. "I believe you." He raised his revolver. Before his finger found the trigger, a rifle shot cracked across the valley floor and tore the hat clean off his head. Every outlaw in the yard went for a weapon at once. The silent rancher had made his arrival known. Chaos tore through Eagle Pass. Horses screamed and reared. Men scattered for whatever cover they could find. Elias fired only when he had a clean shot, driving guards away from the wagons instead of chasing them down one by one. Children cried out beneath the canvas covers. A spooked horse broke its harness and dragged a wagon sideways into another, jamming the whole narrow crossing with splintered wood and tangled tack. Briggs threw himself bodily into the man holding his rope, driving them both into the dirt. Bound hands or not, he fought like a man with nothing left to lose. Elias pushed forward. A hired gun stepped into his path with a shotgun already leveled. The blast caught him across the left shoulder and spun him half around, pain detonating white and total through his arm. For one long second, the whole world blurred to noise and heat. The outlaw worked the shotgun's action for a second shot. He never got it off. Inside one of the wagons, Emma's older sister Sarah kicked the rear door open with everything she had, and the heavy timber slammed into the gunman's back hard enough to stagger him. That single stolen heartbeat was all Elias needed. One shot. The shotgun dropped harmlessly into the dust. Kane saw the fight slipping away from him and made his choice fast. He abandoned the wagons, grabbed the nearest small boy, and hauled him toward the ferry as a shield. "No closer," his voice cracked on the words. The boy trembled against him, too frightened to fight, and every step Kane took carried him nearer the water. If he reached the far bank, he'd disappear into it, into a whole country where nobody would ever find him again. Elias lowered his revolver. There was no angle. One wrong shot and an innocent boy paid for it. Then Briggs, still half-bound, blood streaking his face, charged in from the side without a moment's hesitation and drove into Kane with everything he had left in him. The boy tore free. Both men went down together, tumbling down the muddy riverbank in a tangle of limbs. Kane's hand found a hidden knife. Briggs caught his wrist before it could rise. They grappled for only a few seconds before the soaked bank simply gave way beneath them, and both men vanished together into the rushing current. Elias ran to the edge. The river carried branches and mud and debris past in a brown churn, and for several unbearable seconds, nothing broke the surface. Then Briggs came up, barely conscious, one arm hooked around a drifting log. Kane never surfaced. Whether the river took him or he slipped away beneath it and lived, no one would ever say for certain. His empire ended there, not with a trial, not with a hanging, not with any of the noise men like him usually made on their way out, just silence. The children were free. Some cried openly. Others simply stood there, too wrung out to fully believe they'd survived it. Sarah found Emma waiting by the wagons, and the sisters held on to each other without a single word passing between them, none needed. Bruises, dust, tears, none of it mattered anymore. They'd found each other. But relief didn't erase everything that had been lost. Thomas Avery would never walk out of that mine. Somewhere out past Red Hollow, families who'd spent years searching would finally bury the people they'd been looking for. Sheriff Briggs pulled through, though the river left him carrying injuries that would ache for the rest of his life. And Elias's shoulder healed slow and wrong, leaving his left arm permanently weaker than it had been. Even the ones who walked away carried scars. Some you could see, some you couldn't. Weeks later, lawmen searched the abandoned mine and recovered Kane's hidden ledgers, years of names, dates, and prices that finally let families put names to the disappearances that had haunted this stretch of territory for half a decade. Some of those searches ended in reunions. Others ended quietly at gravesides with prayers instead of homecomings. Elias went back to his empty ranch without fanfare. He mended fence, fed his horses, watched the sun go down over the same stretch of frontier it always had. He never asked anyone for thanks, and he never expected a single song written in his name. Sometimes the truest courage belongs to the people who simply choose to ride toward someone else's suffering on the day everyone else decides to look away. The frontier was never really shaped by the fastest gun in the territory, or the richest man who ever ran cattle across it. It was shaped by ordinary people who refused to turn their backs when someone else's life hung in the balance, even when doing so cost them everything they had. Real courage rarely announces itself. If this story stayed with you a little after it ended, let that be the reason why. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe for more dark frontier tales built on courage, sacrifice, and the history nobody talks about. And tell us in the comments, what would you have done standing under that cottonwood tree, looking at those first small footprints in the dust?